let's see here. So we are wrapping up the end of the objectivist argument essay, and it shouldn't take us too long. Let's see how he rounds out the rest of this. Oh, I can't do that. Okay, good. We'll leave it like that then. Okay, last two sections are the argument from the... let me turn this light on so I can read just a little bit better here. Oh, I can't. Okay, that might help. And we'll go like this. What are you doing? What are you doing? Come on. There we go. All right. The argument from the psychological origin of ethical beliefs. Okay, so let's see what he says. Another argument is that ethical beliefs can be explained psychologically as having originated from non-ethical factors such as fear of punishment. Now, there must be a psychological history of the origin of any beliefs, and there must have been a time when no ethical ideas or beliefs yet existed. I love the way he's thinking about this question. Okay. Both in the history of the individual and in the history of the race. But this does not prove that ethical beliefs originated solely from the pre-existing ideas through a sort of confusion and were not due to a genuine cognition of properties really present. There was also a time when there were no logical or mathematical ideas, but nobody would entertain a similar argument against logic or mathematics. That's a great paragraph. Let's just talk about it for a quick second here. So we'll probably read an essay on using psychology to sort of explain away moral sentiments, that thing that the deontologist, this moral faculty and conscience and all of that. And they'll say, well, we know where you get these ideas from. When you're 1, you don't have these ideas. And when you're 2, you don't, but you start developing this part at 3 and this part at 4 and whatever. I'm sure you develop elements of your psychology necessary to making moral judgments at 1 and 2 also. But see, we can explain where it comes from, and it comes from, these events and these discoveries, and, you get punished or scolded or something. And so you start, internalizing a fear of that negative thing and blah, 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 blah. Right. We get the idea. So, we'll probably look at an essay from that perspective, and we'll have to take a look at how serious that seems to us. However, in this essay, it's proposed that anything which has an origin, right? I'd like to put this thought out there because I think this is really, really useful when it comes to looking for origins of things. It's possible that something doesn't have an origin, that it's eternal and it's always been there. And there's certainly an argument for some of the objectivists regarding ethics that say, no, rationality exists because God is rational, eternally rational, and he's made a world for us to understand. And moral sentiments exist because God is good. And it's based in something that has no origin because he has no origin. However, there's lots of, we looked at arguments like that in the God section. However, if something were to have an origin and you were to discover that origin, by definition, the origin must be the thing emerging out of its absence or its opposite. That's always the case. Because if you purport to find the origin of anything, let's just stay with morality here, or moral sentiments or something. Well, if you discover the origin of them in a person and you see that moral sentiments pre-exist that person, then you haven't really found the origin of moral sentiments. You've just found them in that one person. But if you find the origin of morality or an ethical sense or something like that, you actually find it. Why would you be surprised that you found it where it doesn't go back any further? That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, is what he's saying. That doesn't mean it's not a real discovery or objectively true, which again, for him, objectively just means it's true apart from how we feel, essentially. All right. That's the main part of what he cares about with objectivity of ethics. So let's pause there. What do you think about that before we read how he fleshes that argument out? The argument is, look, before you psychologists even start talking to me, I'm sure you can explain how this starts this way and this starts that way, but that doesn't mean that the thing that you have isn't something real or about something real just because you can find its origin. Um, there was a time when mathematics didn't exist, and I'm sure you can figure out the ancient psychological path in anthropology for how humans started to develop mathematical concepts and then become aware of them and then develop them. Okay, it was started in a non-mathematical way, perhaps, or maybe math is eternal, right? But if it did start in a non-mathematical way, would you then say, oh my gosh, this thing emerged out of its absence or its opposite, which is the only way anything can originate? If it already existed, you haven't found its origin by definition. If you find the origin of mathematical ideas and you say, oh my gosh, the origin is out of something that isn't mathematical, it's like, okay, congratulations. Does that make you think that, 2 plus 2 is not an objective truth? No, it doesn't. So that's basically the way he wants to approach this. So far, so good. Let's see how he does it. Further, to be specific about ethics on the strength of a theory as to the origin of ethical ideas would be to give up the more for the far less certain. Indeed, the extremely uncertain. For such a skeptical theory would rest on the psychology of children if applied to individual development, and the psychology of ancient peoples, he says savages, if applied to evolutionary development of the race. But owing to the impossibility of obtaining reliable introspective evidence, the psychology of children and savages, at least when we consider their higher mental processes or the beginnings of such, is speculative in the extreme. Okay, so that's his second point. His second point is, okay, I'm sure you can tell me a very impressive story about how we developed moral sentiments. And maybe you're right, but you're talking about stuff that developed 250,000 years ago. If we share it with the apes 8 million years ago, if we share it with other creatures, these things developed a really long time ago. And you're talking about sophisticated conscious ideas and why we have them in deep dark ancient origins that you might tell me a very impressive story, but I am aware that there's a huge element of speculation involved in that. And you know I'm not sure you're right. I'm not sure you could be convincingly right, no matter how much evidence you think you could have or how good your story sounds. So that's a second criticism of the eye. So he's hitting back with more than one swing here. To quote from Broad, quote, of all branches of empirical psychology, that which is concerned with what goes on in the minds of babies must, from the nature of the case, be one of the most precarious. Babies, whilst they remain such, cannot tell us what their experiences are, and all statements made by grown persons about their own infantile experiences on the basis of ostensible memory are certainly inadequate and probably distorted. The quote goes on. The whole of this part of psychology, therefore, is and will always remain a mere mass of speculations about infantile mental processes, but put forward to explain certain features in the lives of grown persons and incapable in principle of any independent check or verification. Such speculations, the quote continues, are of the weakest kind known to science, unquote. All right. The psychology of primitive savages is in an equally or almost equally weak position. Some of our ethical judgments, on the other hand, I should insist, are quite or almost as certain as any judgment. And even if the reader is not prepared to go so far, he must admit that they are at any rate far more certain than could be any theory founded on the psychology of children and savages which explain them away. Or he might have meant which purport to explain them away, because his first criticism was just because you can explain the origin of something doesn't mean you've explained it away. Explain the origin of science, that doesn't mean that all your science is not objectively true anymore. Okay, the same uncertainty must attach to any theory of ethics or and the way he just put this second point quite sharply was, look, we have lots of debates in ethics. Some of our debates are on topics we're pretty darn sure about. It's wrong to torture innocent babies for fun. There's an ethical statement. We can be pretty sure that's correct. to a degree that's way more that deserves way more confidence than a speculative theory about what happened 250,000 years ago to our species to get us to start having certain feelings that might explain the origin of why we feel certain ways about certain ethical things. So he's saying, what kind of are we on equal playing ground here? You're going to come and smash ethics apart by looking at not psychology, but the psychology of ancient species, of primitive peoples, and of infants who can't talk. All right, so that's his second point. All right, let's see here. The same uncertainty must attach to any theory of ethics or analysis of ethical terms based on the way in which children learn to use the use of the terms. Such a theory is irrelevant unless it is based on a study of what children exactly have in mind and what their mental processes are when they use the words. And how can we possibly have a well founded idea of that when they cannot introspect or adequately report introspections? All right, we're going to pause here and just say psychology is one of the most interesting subjects to me. And one of the reasons why it's so interesting is that it can't help itself from being a sphere that's sort of in both realms. On one end of psychology, you have behavioralists. You have people who want to define everything based on something they can measure about the actions of the entity doing them. All right, that's about as far as you can get almost on one side of this. And on the other side, you have Jungian dream interpretation, right? So it's like we're going to be as objective and scientific as possible, or we're going to study and learn things about something that is only experienced by a subject and has no other real or not much of a measurable consequence outside of that. That even if you can say, well, the brain is doing certain things when you're having a dream and you can measure that, the experience of the dream and the emotional content of it is because it's presented as a narrative story inside your mind. And that's subjective inherently. Like the content of the dream is subjective and it's happening to the sleeping subject. So psychology is sort of like half in religion, theology, mysticism, and dream world talk, and it's half in taking a lot of surveys and carefully observing the actions of babies when they're crawling towards something that looks like a ledge but isn't, and all sorts of fun things. Having said that, I think psychology is a really interesting subject, and I think that the psychologists who try to do things in an objective way have come up with very, very clever methods for trying to deal with the inherent difficulties that are being pointed out by Ewing here. So, having said that, let's move on. Westermarck contends that objectivity is disproved by the fact that, do I want to say that? We'll have another opportunity. Westermarck contends that objectivity is disproved by the fact that ethical judgments are based on emotion. But he does not even try, as far as I can see, to disprove the view that emotions only provide a psychological condition in the absence of which we should not have been in a fit state ever to intuit the characteristic of goodness or the relation of obligation. I certainly should not admit that the emotion was normally or originally prior to, or at least a confused apprehension of good or evil, righteousness or wrongness. But even if I, like some, even among the objectivists and non naturalists, admitted this and made the feeling of the emotion a necessary prior condition of the apprehension, Westermarck's conclusion would not follow. The making of an ethical judgment will, in any case, presuppose various psychological conditions, but it does not follow that the judgment must be about these conditions. Nobody would argue that ethical judgments must all really be about breathing, because breathing is a necessary condition without which we cannot have made the judgments. We'll put his analogy at the end aside for a second, but that's let's just quickly look at this argument. What he's saying is, okay, let's say it was the case that psychologists figured out that every time you make a moral judgment, it is preceded by an emotional, non-conscious, non-rational event in your mind. Every time you decide murder is wrong or anything is wrong, there's a common emotional thing that we've detected that happens within you before you make that judgment. He says, I'm not sure that's the case. I think sometimes the emotions might come after, or maybe you can make judgments without the emotions or whatever. But he says, even if that was the case, why does that suggest to anybody that the moral judgments are nothing more but an emotive thing? You have to breathe to make moral judgments. Does that mean that the breathing is what makes the moral judgment? Um, Part of your moral judgment can be connected to, obviously he's leaving room open here to say, I don't think it's the case that it comes first. I think often you might make a moral judgment that's against your emotional inclinations or something. But even if it was the case that you think you're doing that, but really your emotions are at war with each other, and the predictable emotional states that the psychologists have identified for whatever judgment you're going to make always happen prior, it's not clear that that's a causal connection, he says. He denies that's what it entails at all. Okay. That's the end of how he's going to respond to that attack. So remember, here's what he's done so far. He's admirably said, hey, I want to argue that moral truths, moral judgments are about things, and they would be true or false even if nobody felt anything about them or thought them correctly. They're not just a subsection of a psychological thing within us. And he defines that type of attitude as subjective and his type of attitude as objective. So we'll stick with his definitions for the purposes of this paper. And then he says, okay, well, this is where I stand. Let's do it. And then he attacks subjectivity by showing the difficulties first with translating murder is wrong to I feel bad about murder. And he came up with like 6 issues where those are clearly not equivalent the way we're actually using them. And then he thought that he did a good enough job of pushing back against the emotivists. And then he said, okay, let's consider the case against objectivism, my position. And so he seemed to focus on this idea that because there are differences, and sometimes it appears very vast and wildly antithetical positions that people have, saying this is right, no, the opposite is right, and that kind of thing, that means that these are all just emotional things that are peculiar to certain people, and that there's no actual right or wrong. And then he attacks that or defends against it, because he says, even if I'm attacking subjectivism, maybe objectivism is wrong too. We should just be skeptics, which he lumps in as another category of subjectivists by his definition, but whatever. So he says, all right, so I've got to defend objectivism against those charges. And he comes up with a bunch of arguments. We won't have to rehearse them here exactly, but we can look at them again later. And real briefly, his arguments are against the idea, that there's these differences. So he takes all of the categories of many differences in ethical realms. He says a lot of these are differences about facts. A lot of them are differences about what you think is the likely outcome of a certain event. That's not really an ethical difference, because you would agree that if the outcome was this, this would be bad. And if it was this, it might not be. You just disagree about what the outcomes would be. And he just chops them up into all these different disagreements. And then he says, but there's still, some are actual ethical differences. And he says that doesn't, what's left there is not a challenge to the idea that we're trying to work out what's right. And he comes up with a lot of explanations for why we should expect to be in the situation we're in without total agreement. And he likens, again, he likes to do this, and he does it, I think, kind of impressively, or at least it's salient. It stands out that this is what he does, is he'll often say, well, would you accept the same type of argument against the study of physics? There's disagreement within the study of physics. Would you accept that argument since different cultures have different ideas of physics? Would you say there's no such thing as objective truth about physics? Like, no, we're working this subject out, and we've got a lot to work out, but these arguments aren't so they're not what you think they are at first, where most of them are just we're all in a different dream or something. Okay. Then he talks about the role of intuition, which is what we just, oh no, I'm sorry. Then he talks about an argument from psychological origin, which is what we just read. So he says, well, there's another attack against objectivity of moral judgments that comes from people who say, look, I'm a psychologist and I've been studying, and a child is 2 and they learn fairness, or they instinctively think they have it or whatever. And then these things happen, and the child develops and their moral sense develops, and we can trace it and all of this. He says, okay, a couple of things. One, we're talking about the moral judgments. Those are sophisticated ideas of propositional nature. And if you can figure out how they originate, if you're tracing that back to childhood, you are not really privy to the evidence of what the child's actually thinking. They can't give you an accurate report. Even adults can't give you an accurate report of what they're really thinking. Certainly, children without language can't. So, you're in a very speculative and tentative realm of psychology when you're dealing with that sort of thing. You could be right or wrong, but what's the certainty value that we would attach to your theory? It would be a lot smaller than the certainty value we might attach to certain ethical judgments that we've argued out to say it's always wrong to torture babies for fun. I mean, geez, I've got a lot more certainty about the second one than I do about the first. And so I'm not sure that you really can take apart the idea of this entire subject means nothing just because of this other subject. But before he does that, he makes a totally different argument, which I think is probably an even stronger one, which is, if you could accurately tell me for sure how people go from not knowing, I mean, here's an idea. He should have said this because this was sort of his line of thinking, right? Hey, psychologist, can you tell me how children learn object permanence? Oh, yeah, we can give you a whole story about how they learn object permanence. Okay, does that mean that we're all under an illusion and talking about nothing when we expect objects to still be there after we leave the room just because you showed how the child came to understand that? That's really what his first point was, and I think it's a much stronger point. Right? The idea is, okay, if you could give me the origin of something, first of all, it's the child psychology, but secondly, as a species, he says you have to go back 250,000 years at least and speculate about what life was like for people that you've never interviewed before to figure out, a story. And maybe you can make progress there, but it's very, very tentative. But even if you could give me a perfect story of exactly how we came to have our moral faculties turned on and sharpened and cultivated and developed in certain ways or whatever, and how we got to the point of having certain feelings that murder is wrong and always wrong and things like that. If you can do that for an individual, or you can do it for a culture or for a species, that's fine. But would can you do that for mathematics and science? Sure. Does that make you not believe in the subjects of math and science? No. So you can do it with ethics. So why would you then say, but therefore the subject's nothing but these psychological underpinnings? Anyway, I think that what I want to do is read an essay that's a stronger argument from a psychological perspective against the objectivity of ethics, and then I want us, maybe we'll have to, good, Edward and Paps might not have put in a better argument than this, but let's, I think, try to see how that stands up against this way of responding to that type of argument, if we try to take it to that. Okay, the last section in this, he says the role of intuition, which Mark had hinted at yesterday. Probably the hold on. Probably the principal reason which makes people inclined to deny the objectivity of ethics is the fact that in ethical argument, we are very soon brought to a point where we have to fall back on intuition, so that disputants are placed in a situation where there are just two conflicting intuitions, between which there seem to be no means of deciding. All right, now he's bringing up a third argument, which seems stronger maybe than the other two he defended against. Well, he's saying this is why it feels this way. It feels like there's no such thing as objective morality or ethical statements, because he's affirming that at the base of these things, it either seems or actually is grounded in intuition. However, it is not only ethics, but all reasoning which presupposes intuition. I cannot argue A, therefore B, therefore C, without seeing that A entails B and B entails C, and this must either be seen immediately or require a further argument. If it is seen immediately, it is a case of intuition. If it has to be established by a further argument, this means that another term, D, must be interlopated between A and B, such that A entails D and D entails B, and similarly with B and C. And then the same question arises about A entailing D. So that sooner or later, ultimately, right, we must come to something which we see intuitively to be true, as the process of interpolation cannot go on ad infinitum. We cannot, therefore, whatever we do, get rid of intuition if we are to have any valid inference at all. It may, however, be said that in subjects other than ethics, people at any rate agree in their intuitions. Okay. But outside mathematics or formal logic, this is by no means universally true. There is frequent disagreement about matters of fact as to what has happened or will happen or concerning the causes of something. And when we have exhausted the arguments on a given point in these matters, there still remains a difference between the ways in which these arguments are regarded by the disputants. In any science where you cannot prove your conclusions, but only make them more or less probable, there will be different estimates as to the balance of probability. As in ethics, you have to balance different values against each other in order to decide what you ought to do. So here, you have to balance different probable arguments. And in order to do this, you must rely at some point or other on an estimate of their strength, which cannot itself be further justified by mediating reason or by, by mediate reasoning. Yet, when everything has been said in the way of argument, people may not all agree. Some will attribute more weight to one consideration, others to another, as they do in ethical questions about what is the right action in a given case. Our decision as to which of two probable arguments is the stronger may be influenced by other arguments in turn, but in order to deal with the situation rationally, we must also estimate the weight of these other arguments, so that in the last resort, it is a matter of insight into their nature, which cannot be settled by other arguments ad infinitum. Just as in a demonstrative argument, you must see intuitively how each step follows from the preceding one, so in the case of probable argument, you must rely on estimates of the degree of probability given by the argument as compared to that given by arguments on the other side. And these estimates, unless the degree of probability can be mathematically calculated, must either be themselves intuitive or be deduced from other estimates which are intuitive. All right, I'm trying to think about how strong a case this is. I'm just going to pause for a second before we finish this. I think so there's a principle that we employed yesterday when we were doing this, and I should have taken a moment to actually highlight it and talk about it. It's a very, very, very important principle of thinking. It's a very important principle within philosophy. If people understood this principle, the Twitter conversations would be a lot better all the time. And the principle is called the principle of charity. What that means is if you want to argue fairly in an intellectually appreciable way, you're supposed to follow this rule. Of course, there's Euthyphroian academics everywhere, and real academics don't, they exist too. But that's what we're here to do. So let's learn the rule. The rule of charity goes like this. If your opponent makes an argument or somebody is making an argument and you're trying to evaluate it for whatever reason, like we're trying to do with this, we're trying to understand it and then we're trying to judge it. And you can interpret that argument in more than one way based on the way they put it. Choose to assume that it's the stronger of the two arguments that your opponent intended. So we read this with charity, and I'll say, when he's talking about, because the language he uses is not to me exactly as sharp and clear as it could be. So I think one of the things, it was nice to highlight that. It might not seem that important with what I'm about to say here, but one of the things that would make us understand his argument a little bit stronger is when he's talking about settling something in a science, imagine he's talking about a political science, something more akin to like the fuzziness of ethics than particle physics, say, right? Particle physics does have probability, but those probabilities can be calculated, right? And so he's sort of setting apart what he's trying to say is even in particle physics, of course, when you get to something where there are estimates that need to be made, you will have different interpretations and different intuitions from the different thinkers. But let's put particle physics aside and say clearly in political sciences, that's a thing, right? In psychology, there's an awful lot where it's like, well, it's not like we've conclusively shown something here. So you're looking at the same evidence I'm looking at, but I'm weighing certain evidence as more important, and you're weighing other evidence as more important. And so we're disagreeing. And that's all based in our intuitions. And he's saying that doesn't make you scrap and throw away all those other subjects. And it's exactly the same with ethics. All right. So if somebody were to read this and say, what he means is that the most solid science possible, and if there's any element of probability, then it's it could be anything still. That's clearly not what he's trying to say. And so you should feel ashamed of yourself if you really successfully demolish the worst interpretation of your opponent's argument when there was a better one that you could have been engaged in. Part of being an academic is saying we want the good conversation. We're not going to have the good conversation if you keep insisting on the worst possible interpretation of everybody else's argument. We could be having a better one, namely the one where you attack and engage with the better interpretation of your opponent's argument. And so there's something illicit about not following the rule of charity. And I want to be clear about this. This charity principle is not an etiquette principle. It's a logical fallacy principle. That's where it comes from. It's so we won't talk about it anymore, but that I thought that was a nice thing to just do a little side tangent thing on. I think I saw Alana unmute. Is that the case?
Yes. I just wonder if you mentioned two conflicting intuitions a bit earlier.
Yes.
And okay, could you please rephrase or repeat at least how does he name the two conflicting intuitions? Is it one intellectual and the other maybe sourcing to desires and emotions? Maybe the latter one is a bit more primitive.
No,
I don't know.
No, that's right. No, I think what he's trying to address are disagreements and intuitions between two people. So you and I are debating whether or not abortion should be legal. And you take one position and I take another position. And then we talk about it fairly and honestly and in good spirit and good faith. And we both agree on all the facts. We agree on the statistical facts. We agree on the consequences. We agree on everything about prenatal development. We agree on every fact together. And yet we still don't agree on whether or not abortion should be legal or not. And the question is, wait a minute, if it comes down to intuition and we both agree on all the facts, and yet you have an intuition that's the exact opposite of mine, and you have it passionately and you have it with reason and you have this opposite ethical judgment than I have, how are we to explain that? And he's saying, well, some people explain it by the idea that ethical judgments are not objective. They're just unique to the subject, and they're not really true apart from people. In the sense that some people would think mathematics is true, whether anybody agrees or not. And he's saying, so it's between my intuitions and your intuitions. And he's saying, now, wait a minute, hold on a second here. There's a lot of factors going into a subject like ethics. It's like politics. It's like psychology. It's like all sorts of things. Like, are you going to get the exact same dream interpretation, psychological counseling from two different counselors? Well, you might, but if they're disagreeing, even though they agree on the details of the dream and stuff, it's like, well, one is weighing one thing more than another is. They're all agreeing about what's there, but this seems more important to one person and this other thing seems more important to the other. And he's saying that's like you and I disagreeing about abortion. It's like we agree on all the facts and yet we have an opposite moral judgment. So how can moral judgments be true? Is what someone might say. And he says, well, wait a minute, that's easy. This is complicated. This involves probability. This involves putting different weights on different elements of the situation. So I think ethics can still be objective, and yet we can understand that it's the sort of thing that we could have intuitional differences on. Does that make sense?
I'm sorry, it does, yes.
Yeah, so it's okay, good. Okay, yet we cannot surely therefore conclude that the scientific or historical propositions under discussion are really only propositions about the state of mind of the people who assert them, or that they are neither true nor false, or that they have, so he's going to use history. Did I skip a sentence here? It sounds like he's going to say, just like history, we can have disagreements about what was right or wrong in history. Well, not even right or wrong. Let's see. I do not wish to maintain that reasoning in these matters is altogether analogous to that which occurs in dealing with ethical questions, but at any rate, it is the case here that as in ethics, we are often confronted with a situation in which we either see or do not see and cannot logically prove that what we seem to see is true. Yet we cannot surely therefore conclude that the scientific or historical propositions under discussion are really only propositions about the state of mind of the people who assert them, or that they are neither true nor false, or that they have no justification whatever for believing any of them. So he said science or historical. All right. So we can imagine that for an analogous situation. We could say, I can know all the facts that it's possible to know about what was happening in Rome on the day that Caesar was stabbed to death. And you can know all those same facts. And I can say, I think Caesar was afraid of the knives once he saw them. And you can say, look, he saw them that morning. That morning he saw them. It was clear in a dream, and he said, cowards die many deaths. I will move forward and not be afraid. And so you can be really confident that he wasn't afraid, and I can be really confident that he was afraid for whatever reasons, that I'm weighing one element more than another, that you're weighing differently or whatever, even though we agree on all the facts. And then he says, okay, here's what, there's lots of things we could do. We could try to settle it this way or that way or whatever. But here's what we would never say. Oh, Caesar never existed. There are no true statements we can make about Caesar because we disagree on something intuitive and there's no clear reason or way that we could settle it. You feel very confident about your position and I feel confident about mine, and they're based on our intuitions and also based on looking at all the facts. So therefore, there is no truth to whether or not Caesar was afraid or not afraid on the day that he was stabbed when he first saw the knives. It's like nobody would ever conclude that. And he's saying, why are you concluding that with ethics? Right? That is not an argument you would have even imagined putting forward about historical or scientific facts, because these are complicated things and we might weigh one thing more than another between us. And so what the heck is this argument? That's kind of cool. All right. Finishing up. Maybe. We must therefore have intuition, and in a subject where infallibility is not attainable, so that's the key. Separate the subjects where, we can't know for sure and settle questions forever. Intuitions will sometimes disagree, no matter what the subject is, in history or sciences or ethics. If it's not something that you can be absolutely certain about, you can't argue someone perfectly to the total knowledge, well, then there's going to be disagreements and intuitions, but you wouldn't scrap any of the other subjects because of that. So why is that evidence that ethics is not really about something? He says, okay, some philosophers indeed prefer not to call them intuitions when they are wrong. But then the problem will be to distinguish real from ostensible intuitions, since people certainly sometimes think they see intuitively what is not true. Now, Lord Russell says, quote, since no way can even be imagined for deciding a difference as to values, the conclusion is forced upon us that the difference is one of tastes, not one as to any objective truth, unquote. But what I have said shows that we can imagine plenty of ways. I have indicated that errors as to judgment of value may arise A, from lack of the requisite experience, B, from intellectual confusions of some sort, C, from failure to attend adequately to certain aspects of the situation or of the consequences, or D, from psychological causes such as those with which the psychoanalyst deals. Therefore, to remove errors, we may A, supply the lacking experiences, or failing this, if possible, describe it in a way which will make its nature clear to the other party. We may B, dispel intellectual confusions by making adequate distinctions or exposing actual fallacies, such as make a person think he has seen that A is C when he has really only seen that A is B and mistakenly identified B with C. We may C, suggest the direction of attention to the neglected points, or we may D, use psychological methods. And we shall, if we are wise, also look out to see whether we ourselves have tripped up in any of these ways. Further, even when inference cannot completely prove or disprove, we may use it to confirm or cast doubt on ostensible intuition. The large class of errors, which result mainly from an unwillingness really to seek for the truth, can hardly be used as an argument against objectivity, since they are due to the moral fault of the persons who are in error and could have been removed if the latter had tried. In these cases, the trouble is not that there is no means of deciding, but that the means are not used. Okay, so that's a third argument here that's kind of important. And sometimes his arguments don't seem that powerful to me. And then sometimes they seem like a really cool punch square in the nose. What he's saying right here is look, you say that there's all these disagreements in ethics, so therefore it can't really be about something. Do you know how hard it is to settle questions like this? This is extremely complicated. Are you really saying that all these people who disagree have put all of the necessary intellectual work in? These are emotional creatures. Most of them aren't even aimed at really knowing. They're just hurt about something or passionate about something else or hateful or whatever. All of these disagreements are not from people who have spent 80 years thinking as seriously and as hard as they can and being objective as possible and looking out for errors and talking it out. I mean, these disagreements are coming from people who are moral amateurs anyway, right? That's an interesting idea. As if there were a bunch of people doing, if actually, here's an argument. If you looked at Twitter, you would find that there's a bunch of cosmologists and physicists who don't have any degrees who are doing cosmology and physics really badly. Would you look at that mess of insanity and YouTube videos? Maybe the universe is like an inside out eggshell, or maybe the universe is like this. And there's talking and talking and talking about all these. I'm not necessarily picking on that specific idea. I don't know. But all these different ideas, look at that and say, oh my gosh, physics is just people emoting. There's no real physics. There's no way to answer the question. In fact, the subject itself is not about anything. Look at how much people disagree in their intuitions. It's like, okay, what about the physics community? Do they disagree that radically about everything? No. In the areas they do disagree, do they all admit that it's speculative and we haven't settled the question yet? Yes. You wouldn't throw out physics for that. And he says you're making that error when you say, well, everybody gets to have an opinion in ethics. And since they have so many disagreements, I think ethics isn't about something. How about be a serious ethicist and look at just them and say, are they just as varied? Okay, we get the point. The methods I've suggested will not always be successful. All right, so before we move on to finish this, anybody have anything to say? We'll pause for a minute because we've covered a lot of arguments here already. It's good arguments. Okay, let's wrap it up. The methods I have suggested will not always be successful. But then, is there any sphere in which human efforts always do succeed? Even the methodology of physical science cannot lay down rules which will guarantee that any scientist can make discoveries or show him in detail in advance how to prove to others the truth of the discoveries when made. I am not claiming that it is possible in practice to remove all ethical differences. But how do we know that it could not be done if there were a will on each side to listen to what the other had to say and an intelligence to discern the best methods to adopt in order to facilitate a decision? Right? He's very clear about this. For him, the question of the objectivity of moral statements is not that we own them, that we've got it all right, or even that it's likely we ever could. What he's saying is for you to say that they're not objective is for you to know something that you don't have any evidence for. The fact that we're confused, the fact that we've got disagreements, the fact that none of that means that it's not about something. And that's what you were trying to say. And for Ewing, it's as likely to be about something as mathematics is, as physics is. All of those things have exactly the same qualities in their arguments, he's saying. And certainly history and psychology and the other subjects that are more akin to the types of complications that a subject like ethics about human behavior is. Okay. Even in the methodology of science, I am not claiming it is possible in practice to remove all ethical differences, but how do we know that it could not be done if there were a will on each side to listen and the intelligence to discern the best methods to adopt, right? He's not saying we could do that. He's saying, how do you know that if we were doing that, we couldn't all come to no longer have so many disagreements? There's a lot of disagreements about history. They keep going. They're not just disappearing. But you wouldn't say history isn't about anything. It's just people emoting. Why are you saying that about ethics? Okay. We know what he's saying. All right. A person cannot be brought into agreement even with the established truths of science if he will not listen to what the scientist says. And there is no reason to think, even with ethical intuitions, that there are not describable processes by which any cause of error can, on principle, be removed. He's not even saying that this is practically going to happen. He's saying your assertion is that there's no way it could have ever happened, no matter how angelically holy we were aimed at figuring this out and how serious we were to do the difficult thinking to figure these things out. You're claiming to know ahead of time that that wouldn't work. For no reason, as far as he can tell. I insert the words on principle. Okay, look, I emphasized it for that reason. So he's going to emphasize it and say, this is the point he's trying to make. I insert the words on principle simply because it will still often be the case that none of the disputants thinks of the right way of removing the error, or that the person in error will not or cannot take it, as also occurs in disputes about questions of fact outside ethics. So that's his last point. I'm impressed with it, so I keep repeating it, but let's move on. Where the intuitive belief is due to non-intellectual factors of a kind which vitiate it, there seem to be two possibilities of cure. First, the person concerned may lose all tendency to hold the intuitive conviction when its alleged cause is clearly pointed out to him. The alleged cause is then, in his case, probably at least, an essential part of the real cause. If, on the other hand, the intuitive belief remains unimpaired and the man does not react to the causal explanation in a way which suggests that it has really touched a sore point, this is presumptive evidence that the explanation is mistaken. But secondly, the cure from a false belief due to non-intellectual factors is more likely to arise because the man has been induced to approach the subject in a new spirit than merely because the true causation of the belief has been suggested to him. After all, it is impossible to prove even to an unprejudiced person that such a causal theory as to the origin of a person's belief is really correct. How to induce a person to make such a new approach is a question not of logical argument, but of practical psychology. All right, jump back to that other argument there. Let's move on. We must not think of intuition as something quite by itself, uninfluenced by inference. It is helped by inference, but sees beyond what could be proved by inference. And when when intuitive ethical views differ, we may be made, and when intuitive ethical views differ, use may be made of inference to support one or other of the clashing views, especially by showing that it fits well into a coherent ethical system. This will not settle the question absolutely conclusively, but it can help towards settlement. Perhaps, as the result of the inference, one of the parties to the dispute may realize that he does not see by intuition what he claimed to see, but something rather different. It would thus be a great mistake to say that when two men disagree on an ethical question, there is nothing to be done about it, or that there is no scope in ethics for inference. No argument is available which could prove the subjectivity or fallaciousness of all ethics without establishing a similar conclusion about all other branches of study except mathematics and formal logic. All right, so he said something about math earlier, but he says mathematics and formal logic are free of this. Well, perhaps not. We don't have to pay attention to the exception that much right now. That's a side thing to discuss. All right, that's the end of it. So some of the people we read are very persuasive and seductive. Some of them are very, hey, here I stand, let's have it out. He's very much more the second in the way he's forming his arguments, right? There's nothing rude about it or anything. He's doing a really fantastic job. And it's admirably clear to write in this way. Say, here's what I think. Here's what these people think. And then you can hold them to, well, you misdefined what they think. Or here's my argument against them. Here's me saying I totally defeated them. Well, good. Well, now that's not arrogant. That's listing out all the ways that you can now disagree with me. You can say, oh, no, I agree with your argument against them, but that doesn't actually defeat them the way you thought it did, right? So he's stating every move of his position in a way that is really worth noticing. It's a good way to write if you don't have any other way to write, right? Like if you're not sure, it's be like, well, figure out what you think, write a thesis, figure out why you think it, think about objections to it, think about your responses to those, and then in every paragraph say, here's the point I'm going to make the point, and then say, this thing that I tried to prove in this way has now been proven in that way. And what's nice about that is that's not redundant or annoying. It's a very good way of joining an academic debate to say, hey, if you want to disagree with me, you can now disagree on all of those points or any one of them. And I've been clear that this is what I meant and this is what I think it accomplished. So that's another side point, but we're getting a lot of excuses to talk about some good academic and intellectual principles as tangential points while reading this. We'll stop doing that now. Let's put the book aside. Oh, wait, we should do this for a second. One quick thing. I'm so sorry. All right, moral judgments. We are in the middle of this section, and let's see. We've done the introduction, we've done the deontology, we've done the subjectivity argument. Now we've looked at an objectivity argument. We're going to look at the indefinability of good next. A critique of ethics by Eyre. Some of these names are just going to keep coming up and coming up, so we'll get used to it. Bertrand Russell. We had Ewing that we just finished. The new subjectivism in ethics. So that's another argument. So, of course, we're doing this because Edwards and Pabst are going to be leaning in a direction opposite of what I'm... A refutation of morals. Okay, we're going to attack it again. God damn, this guy. The logical behavior of the word good. Okay, we're going to... All right, so I thought there were only 4 or 5, but there's maybe 7 or 8 of these. So let's just take a quick look at what we're going to be doing here. And that's the end of it. Okay, so anyway, I wanted to take a look at that. Okay, let's pause. A little bit short. We wrapped up that essay. Let's go into some discussion. I know that Edward and Pabst are focusing on this meta-ethical question of subjectivity versus objectivity for the quality of ethical statements. And there's so much more we can do in ethics. So we have our ethics course that we can start, and at some point we probably will. And instead of just sticking to this one meta-ethical question, there's an awful lot of great stuff we could be diving into. However, this is giving us our first dipping our toe in the waters to get a feel for the way people are arguing about ethical statements, at least. And with the deontological argument earlier, we had a lot of foundation ethics, and we had a lot of actual regular ethics and stuff that he was doing as well. So we at least get a taste of it. Why don't we do something new and fun today? Let's just have an ethical debate about something. First let's pause and say, anybody want to say anything about these arguments for the objectivity of moral judgments? You thought they were weak. You thought they were strong. You can think of better ones. You're convinced he's wrong. Anybody want to express any opinions on this last essay and maybe how it responds to or interacts with the subjectivity argument essay that we read on Tuesday? We'll leave open some space for anybody who wants to jump in.
There is objectivity in morals.
There is what?
Objectivity.
You believe there is objectivity in morality. Now,
yes, because I am a theist and I am a Platonist, Neoplatonist, and my mind works in ancient Greek philosophy. So the divine, the agatho, as the Greeks used to say it, Zara, in Greek, it translates to pure in English. Okay, so this is just the best way they could describe with a word that is, since our language is conceptual, they gave that word as a description of God's nature, agatho, purity, etc. So according to if that is the absolute cosmic substance, and the energies of it are what we call divine energies, with love is one of them, etc., then we cannot deny that there is no absolutely objective, divine cosmic morality, or a divine morality up with the cosmic system of ethics being the perfect complementary to create a science, if you wish. Now, I know that it's too
So
early to say these things, but soon
I'm glad you
enough,
did.
I will rumble you.
I'm glad you did, because that's what I wanted to do today, is just open it up for more discussion, since Edward and Paps want to just micro focus on this one thing. I wanted to let's have some more fun. So what's really fun about Alana's perspective as a Platonist is that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I was laughing when you started saying this, is that the question gets turned inside out, because the most real things are the things that are the good. We are mere shadows. We are less objectively real than the ethics. They come from Platonic forms that we aspire to actualize towards, or something like that. Yeah.
Yes, forms and
God's
ideas.
character is more real, and it is the good, something like that, right? And we are halfway between earth and heaven, something like that.
Yes, and you can also, if you'd like to add an example, an illustration, you can see that it is like having the form, which is shapeless, just having the form, and we, the individualities, are the shapes. So there is a connection with the form, there is a connection to the core substance, regardless of
That's how
our.
we can be
It's
real. The only way things can be real is that they participate in the forms to one degree or another, right?
exactly.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't
And
mean to cut you off. Keep going.
no worries, but that's why raising and expanding and evolving our consciousness, it's such a big deal in the end, because it's not just being able to understand and more, deeper, higher, or just calculate stuff a bit better. You get to experience reality and how things actually are in a more truer level. And that it can rarely be articulated properly unless someone has evolved his dhyania, that one
So
Platonic level prior to Mnemosyne, which is, let me add this, our
please.
dhyania. I truly, truly believe that from what I've read, what I've come to understand, our dhyania is the one facet or level of our intellect which is responsible to articulate whatever our Mnemosyne can grasp from the realm of forms, and that requires a trained or cultivated intuitive intellect, or to cultivate our intuition in such a way that it can follow along the trails of spirit, as to connect with the forms, the ideas, and the divine. Having your conscious cultivated is a bonus. It's like
So
offering you white flags. And this is where I'll stop speaking now. Thank you.
no, you're good. I'm gonna put in the private chat a link to a book, and I'd be curious if you read it. It's a PDF of the book. I didn't mean to. You should buy it. Um, so there's a philosopher, Suzanne Langer, who wrote a book on art. It's just a theory of art, so it won't seem why it's connected to what you're saying right now. But it's a theory of art and artists and what they're up to. It's called Feeling and Form. And what occurs to me is that I'd like to hear your view on what she thinks about how artists are getting in touch with the it's post Jung, so like the archetypal forms, and then putting them into a a sculpture or a painting so that we can experience them. It sounds like, if you did read her theory and understand it, what you're saying is we're all artists, in the development of our consciousness, that what we're all doing as we try to get to higher levels of revelation or enlightenment, let's say, is basically being artists. I don't know. I'm sorry. That was just a thought that popped in my head. The other thing to say, though, thank you so much for that. I know you were there last year, and we had a great time looking at Socrates. But I think before you joined us here, this year with the Philosophy 101, is we did a bunch of Socratic stuff. We read a bunch of dialogues by Plato. So it's nice to have a member in the group who is talking about the arche, the ultimate good, the way Socrates was. And we spent some time really studying that and looking at it, especially Savad and I were there at the time. So that was extremely welcome commentary. Thank you. So yeah, how about this? Instead of focusing on these essays, anybody else have a view on the object? Now, again, objectivity of moral judgments in this context just means they're true even if we don't agree. Like, they're not just emotive things, or they're not just preferences of different people. Like, they're not reducible to I like vanilla and you like chocolate, right? So Mark, if you had to put money on it, are moral judgments objective, meaning there's something we could know even if we're not always correct about them, or are they something that only comes from subjects? This is good to me. It's close to the relativist idea, right? This, I find this good or I find this bad, but that's saying as much about me as it is about the thing. Or could it be true that the thing is bad apart from me being inclined to think so?
Could you give another example?
Yeah. So I'm just saying, I'm trying to define it certain ways, but maybe I shouldn't. If you had to put money on the question, are moral judgments objective or subjective, what would you say? Just if you had to put money on
moral judgments, you mean morals in general, or do you mean our perception of morals?
I mean the statement murder is wrong.
Our judgment.
The statement murder is wrong, is that really something that could be true even if nobody agreed with it or felt it? Is it as true that 2 plus 3 make 5? Is it that kind of a statement?
I think so.
Good. Now, imagine you're in a room with 27 people who think the opposite for different reasons. What kind of an argument could you try to make? Mm-hmm. And we're just experimenting with this. We're not expecting you to have an already written essay on it, right? We're just probing ourselves to start thinking about these types of questions. How would we answer that? So, and of course, you're welcome to switch at some point too. You don't have to be stuck with what you said a second ago. But okay, so you think murder is wrong even if nobody agreed. Like 2 plus 3 make 5, even if there are no humans that mathematically sophisticated to know it. Okay. But you're in a room with a bunch of people who don't think so. But they're curious about why you have this view and they want to hear you justify it.
Well, it's an affront to rational beings, but since none of them are in that room, so that wouldn't be a very convincing case.
But they might have reasons.
Mm-hmm.
They might be wrong.
Yeah, they might say,
they might have reasons.
It's every man for himself, right?
They could just say, look, I wish
world if you kill or be killed.
What if one of them said to you, Mark, I used to think like you do, and I wish I still could. I wish it was the case that murder was always wrong. I've just been studying history and looking at how things play out, and I've come to this other conclusion just because but I don't want to think it. I'd rather think it's true. Please give me a reason to think it's true, despite the fact that I've seen how history plays out, and might seems to make right, and people write the history after they win, and they also judge their enemies as evil and all of that. It's like, I used to believe it. Give me a reason to believe it again. I would love to. You can see why philosophy's fun to do and why it's worthwhile to do, because you can know certain things but not know how to justify them, and learning how to justify them
Right.
could make you know them even more, right? Like just because you can't I'm not saying you can't, but just because an individual couldn't necessarily have all the arguments worked out, well, the whole point of reading all these different positions and studying these papers and everything and going through the whole ethics course and everything is to say, well, now I've had the chance to spend some time trying to think, how would I argue that if I had to, for some reason, if it was a game show and they picked two people, or if somebody was
Yeah,
begging
which-
me to have a reason.
Right. It's
So-
it's a very good exercise because it's something that you kind of take for granted being so basic, but if someone from another world came up and said, "I don't understand this. Explain this to me. Could you do it?"
Right. So this is fun because this class is going to give us the excuse. I mean, we're just barely dipping our toe in it, but it's going to let us look at it from lots of different perspectives so we can start to work out how we might ground it. And I think last time you were saying it's groundable in intuition to some degree. You had pointed that out, which he agreed with today.
Mhm.
And
Right.
Alana's-
but they don't have, your audience doesn't have that intuition, so that wouldn't be a convincing argument.
Well, so, okay, but can you make an argument that it's based in intuition, even if other people don't agree with you? Right? Because this is a meta-ethical discussion, right? So they don't have to have the same intuition that abortion is wrong or it's right or whatever that you have. We're talking about it. So can you say, well, how could we do that? Let's compare. You might have to make a case that it's okay to rely on an entire science that's ultimately grounded in intuition. And Ewing does that today. He says that's every science. Every science says A entails B, but you don't have an argument for A entails B. And if you do, it would be A entails D and D entails B. You're never going to get to the point where you're not relying on the intuitive understanding that when I see that A entails B, once I get down to the very basic elements of this, I just see it. I can't justify it beyond that. It's just clear to me. Like, for instance, something cannot be and not be the same thing at the same time in the same way, right? Something can't be both A and not A in the same respect at the same time. Okay, that's true. Can you justify that? I can't think without thinking it. It's intuitively stuck in my brain that something can't both be read and not read at the same time in the same way. Why? What do you mean why? It comes down to intuition. So Ewing is saying everything comes down to intuition at some level. And just because ethics doesn't mean that it's just people feeling however they feel. We can still argue about it from the basic principles. And we do that all the time. That's the nature of our conversation in ethics. And libraries of books have been written by people disagreeing on these things. You think they're all talking about nothing? It's like mathematics. It's like any other science. Alana.
Question. I do not remember if it was Plotinus or Proclus, the one who delved into it more, but they both wrote about it, that the intellect, our intellect, has the cosmic principles, the principles of God, the divine principles, the divine forms, ideas. They are inscribed to our intellect, and our soul is the mediator of this knowledge between the intelligible and our tangible self. So could you see it this way, that if the cosmic moralities, values, and principles are inscribed to our intellect, and we as human beings get to comprehend and grasp internally, maybe a bit intuitively, through our psyche, through our connection with our psyche and our psyche's drives, edges, or pushes, could that be the most instinctive aspect of morality, why murder is wrong, maybe. And then we have the intellectual intuition, which could be more, it could be more in accordance to our ethical systems, our preferences, the structure of self that each one wants to create, etc. How does that sound?
Yeah, once again, uh, very much a Socratic attitude towards it, right? And so one point of clarity that might help is that when we say that ethics is based in intuition, what we're not saying is every moral judgment is just an intuition, right? What we could say is murder is wrong, and somebody could say why. You say because it's not good to increase the general suffering of other people, and murder always does that. Okay, is that all murder does? Is that the only reason it's wrong? Well, no, here's some other arguments. Okay, but whatever the arguments are, well, why is it wrong to increase general suffering and make things worse? And you go back and you go back and you go back in your arguments. So just because we're saying it's grounded in intuition doesn't mean that every judgment itself is nothing but intuition. And as you go back and back, you eventually get to something that you say, look, if you don't agree on this, you're a psychopath. Like, I just don't understand. Like, you might just be blind. I see that the sky is blue and I just see it. And the divine command theorists have a certain type of argument, but there are others who have an origin of ethics that comes from the divine. That's not exactly divine command theory, which is similar to what Elena is saying here, I think, which is, you live in a world that is rationally comprehensible. You live in a world that has moral truths. Both of those ultimately come from the rationality and the inherent virtue of the source of being, right? So there's even arguments for God that take that form, and we saw that before, that say, well, X can't exist unless there's a God, but X does exist, therefore there's a God, right? And this is looking at it from the other side, which is, well, how is it that we can have X? And they're saying, well, the only way you can have it is that it ultimately has to be grounded in some divine goodness. But the religious take that and then they add their theology and they add their revelation from their scriptures and they flush it out and they say, well, God created a world where he could relate to his creations made in his image. So he made them capable of using reason and of having moral faculties like a compass that would tell them what right and wrong is. And they can drift away from him or they can find him, but the fact that they have those things is explicable because of the source of being, which is, of course, God in those that subset of religious traditions I'm alluding to right now. And so it's also, this brings up another thing that's important to say, which is, we've been arguing for God's existence and against it and all of that in the previous section. Sometimes there's a public misunderstanding of the idea that every religious notion is, of course, laughed away by philosophers. You're not supposed to be religious. That it cannot be further from the truth. The vast majority of the most serious thinkers in the history of philosophy were very religious and were religious in their thinking explicitly. Now, there is a rule, which is you can't say, I'm right because God told me so. I mean, you can say that, you can be a prophet, but you're not doing philosophy. Inside philosophy, you have to have arguments and see how far you can get with arguments. But that doesn't mean that you can't argue that your religion is correct, right? You just can't do it just because you decided it's correct or something like that. And again, that isn't even saying that other people in other fields can't do that, right? It's just within philosophy, that one rule still exists for sure. You have to be doing the rules of right thinking and seeing how far that can get you. But that doesn't mean that, you guys probably know this, but, I've been on Twitter and there's these atheists on Twitter that are very intellectually unimpressive. And they basically just have like a bigoted opinion that if anyone's religious, they must be stupid and mean. And it's like, that is not the attitude in philosophy, certainly not the attitude in the history of philosophy. So if it's surprising to anybody that most of the philosophers talking about this are talking about the divine in one way or another as a necessary thing that plays a role in this, but it doesn't mean that they're just saying, well, let's just insert some belief and then we can get the rest of it. What they're saying is, no, I'm going to argue for why that's true. Now I'm doing philosophy. I'm arguing for the fact that there is a God and that he plays this role. That is completely 1,000,000,000% acceptable inside the conversation. So, and the history of the conversation shows that. So I don't know. I thought I'd underline that. There's another consideration, which is what happens when a group of philosophers in a room, suddenly the door swings open and someone who doesn't want to play by the rules of philosophy enters and says, I have all these truths and they came to me because an angel visited me last night. So I'm not going to give you arguments. I'm just going to tell you all these truths. What do you do in that situation? Well, you don't tell them to leave, but you do ask them questions. If you're going to continue to do philosophy, you could give up philosophy and say, I'm following you because you have the revelation, but you're no longer doing philosophy. Again, I'm not saying you have to do philosophy. We're just trying to draw the line of when are you doing philosophy? What are the rules for in this game? Well, the one thing you don't do is you just say, oh, well, then I believe it, and you go on and you just stop doing philosophy. That's fine. You can do that, but you're not a philosopher anymore. The other thing you don't do, though, is you say, ha, 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 I know that you must be wrong. You don't know that. What you do if you're a philosopher is you ask questions. You say, that's very interesting. What do you mean by that? And I know you say you had it revealed to you, but can we understand that it's true since I don't have that revelation? Can you help me with some arguments? I'm going to ask you some questions. And so even if a person's not being philosophical, but they're being religious, they still have, they have a space in the forum until they choose to leave, basically. And you can see that in the New Testament with Paul. He enters in with the philosophers and he tells them what he thinks the truth is. And they say, hey, we got some questions. He says, no, I already told you the truth. I'm out of here. It's like, okay, fine. Some people left and followed him. Some people mocked him. But to me, the people who wanted to do philosophy, and again, I'm not setting it up as a better thing to do. I'm just seeing where the border is. And I'm saying the border of doing philosophy is saying, well, we wish you would come back tomorrow because we've got more questions. So in any case, those are some of the categories. We're just trying to draw some borders of the relationship between the theological discussion, which can be extremely intellectually rigorous and valuable on its own, and the philosophical tradition, and how the philosophical tradition has a dialectic with the theological, but also has how it has a dialectic with the revealed prophetic religious traditions, the mythopoetic, the mythological side of things. Philosophers don't say, ha, ha, ha. I mean, there are plenty today who do, but they're not going to leave a legacy. If you look at the legacy leaving philosophers, they all don't do this. They don't go, ha, 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 you're not playing our game by our rules, so you must be wrong about everything. They say, hey, I've been playing my game by my rules, and I'm not sure. You could be right. Let's ask some questions. So again, what makes it philosophical is I want the reasons. I'm going to ask some questions because I want to know it for reasons, not because I had a vision or you told me you had a vision. That doesn't count as philosophy. But also what doesn't count as philosophy is saying, ha, 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 you said it was a revelation, so therefore I don't have to think about it. That doesn't count either as philosophy. Okay, so that was another fun little tangential thing to talk about. But I think it's important as we're getting into this to just sort of start getting used to the atmosphere of the conversation and also some of the rules of charity and how we argue with each other, the logical things we got to look at yesterday. I think what's happening is I'm mostly disappointed, not bored. I'm mostly disappointed with Edward and Paps's desire to focus on just this question here when I feel like we could have had a lot more fun in the ethical section. So I'm taking the opportunity to do some side stuff on logic and rules of reason and defining the philosophical realm. So, all right. Savad had a technical issue because he didn't send the message he's leaving, but we are going to actually wrap it up now. So he might be back in a moment while we're doing an after chat. But actually, before I wrap it up, I should say, is there anything else anybody wants to say? And thank you for your contributions, by the way. Like we're here to get comfortable with starting to think through some things and to learn how people argue and what the principles of thoughts are. And everybody's contributions have been most welcome. And we're going to just keep getting better at this as we keep going. That's the entire plan. Oh, the last thing to say is we have a calendar coming out soon. We're going to start some other classes and filling out that calendar. So that will be released soon, and I'm adjusting my work schedule so that we can put even more effort into these things. So there's different people that want to focus on different classes, and the schedule might fill out a little bit more soon. So I'll release the calendar on Twitter, and once that's finished, and yeah, hopefully soon we'll be doing a lot more of this. For those who are just starting to get the idea, because about 50 people or so yesterday watched the video, even though there's only one here right now on the Twitter space or whatever. This is a part of a curriculum, and I won't pull up the whole map of the curriculum, but this is the very beginning backbone course for the first year of a 3-year curriculum thing that is basically the core curriculum that's philosophical as a basis of majoring in something else. So this is the intro, and what we're doing in this is looking at 8 big questions that enduring questions, and questions that have lived in philosophy for a long time and are still alive today. And we're just cherry picking essays from different contributors to get an idea of who the camps are on these battlefields and what sort of armament they use. And what goes along with these classes are other classes where we do the exact same style, only in the first year. The second and third year are very different styles, but in the first year we do that, but we go much more through the entirety of ethics, or we get a nice introduction to a lot more essays and a lot more things to consider in the philosophy of religion or the philosophy of mind. And so metaphysics, those other courses will be started soon. We're going to actually start 2 of them soon, I think, in that new calendar we're going to release. And all of that is this first year stuff. For those of you who are familiar with what we did last year, the second year stuff and the third year stuff is much more dynamic and exciting, but also I'm super thrilled with this stuff. And I think a lot of people are. I'm really happy that there's so much interest in saying, hey, I want to actually get an idea of all the different ways that people are talking here. And then we've got all these extra things we can read and pursue if a subject is particularly interesting to somebody. Okay, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you much.